your seats, please. Thank you so much for being so active during the workshops. I got to go around and listen to all of you, and everybody was super engaged, got great feedback on the tools that you tested. So looking forward to working with you more closely on the outcomes of those discussions of work. Again, I just want to give everybody a moment to sit down because we have such an interesting chat here. I want everybody to be able to see our speakers and hear from them. So I'm delighted to have Addie Ignatius, who is editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review here. In addition to all the great work that HBR does, he's also been pioneering around really tackling sustainability issues and sustainable business issues through the Future Economy Project, which Andrew Winston and I are advisors on, and really helped to create a forum for business leaders to learn more about how do you actually implement sustainable business practices. So we very much appreciate Addie's leadership there. And I think all of you are familiar with Bill McNabb, who first and foremost in his leadership at Vanguard made it possible for many people around the country and around the world to invest in a way that enabled them to grow their portfolios, and has also been really focused on creating long-term value, both in what Vanguard does and now in his role as chairman of CECP, the CEO Force for Good, or I think there's a new name for it now. Is it? No? Yeah, that's okay. The CEO Force for Good. And also, as he'll talk a little bit about, Vanguard now has some new, they've had a presence around ESG for a while, but have some new funds that'll be really interesting to hear about. So without further ado, I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I welcome both of you. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tansi, and it's great that everyone's here. Bill and I decided, we'll talk for a while, and then when we sort of run out of stuff, we'll open it to the floor. It sounds like there've been good discussions all day, so start getting your questions ready. But let's leap right in, because I'm not sure what your view is. Whether, from an investment perspective, do you think there is a favorable ROI on sustainability plays?
So, the very short answer is I don't know. The data are inconclusive. There's a lot, obviously, that's been a huge topic here today and in many other forums. However, the longer answer is I think we look at it, the linkage between, I'll call it sustainability, and this debate between short-termism and long-termism. And as Tansi referenced, I work with CECP on their Strategic Investor Initiative, and the whole push there is around getting companies to think longer term. And if you think about the broadest definition of, you want to have a company that lasts multiple generations, and if you're going to think that way, then that's where, to me, a lot of the work that's being done in this space and the work that we've been doing on the long-termism kind of intersect. And my sense, my intuition is we will find that companies that think that way and more holistically will actually create lots of value over time. And everybody has anecdotal examples of it, but we don't have what I would call a comprehensive study that says, here it is, here's the answer. And and part of it is because the whole definition of sustainability is so broad and can you bring in so many variables. But I do think if you just elevate it to the highest level of what's going on in terms of if you're a company and you're not a great place for people to come to work, over time you're not going to provide great service. You're not going to produce as good a product as somebody who is a good place to work. If you're not a really good citizen of your community, you're not, again, going to attract the kind of talent that you want. I think what's going to be really interesting, Adi, is to watch. I think it's going to be the employment side that's going to drive this more than anything else. And I think investors will have a role. Obviously, I think consumers are obviously going to have a big role. You've seen some of the data on that. But I think it's the employment side is going to be what drives it.
Okay, so there are a lot of things to follow up on.
Yeah, I know. I'm teeing you up for all kinds of stuff.
So let's start with, so we talked a little bit about this a couple days ago, and so this is a somewhat leading question, but in terms of whether there's a favorable ROI on sustainability plays, I mean, your subset is limited. You're taking out some investment. So doesn't that suggest that you're really asking investors to take a smaller return to do the right thing?
Again, I don't know the answer to that. What we've seen historically is, if you go back to the days of the original sort of socially responsible investing movement in the 90s, many of you, well, as I look at this audience, many of you were far too young to remember that, but there are a handful of you who actually lived through that. And in 1997, 1998, 1999, the socially responsible index funds as an example, and we had one of the first, they were blowing the lights out. And everybody was like, see, you can do good and beat the market. Isn't this great? Well, when you did the attribution analysis, what you found is because of the way the exclusionary screens were working, most socially responsible funds had an overweight to technology. Well, we know how that ended in 2001, 2002, and it didn't end in a pretty way. And I can't tell you how many investors, despite good literature and whatnot, were shocked by that. They just couldn't understand what had happened, and the variances were incredible. And so it's an anecdotal answer to your question, but I think what you see is there will be times of, anytime you exclude stocks, certain stocks from a broad market, by definition, you're going to be out of sync with the broad market. You will underperform it sometimes, and you will overperform it sometimes. We have not seen, and I'll come back to this one because I think it's going to be one of the most fascinating areas. I don't think we've seen any active manager who has put their stamp on a sustainable strategy, deliver long-term alpha versus a broad market for a long period of time. I mean, I think that is one of the holy grails that's out there. We're going to try, by the way. All humility aside, we're going to actually, we're launching a new active fund. I can't talk too much about it because the SEC gets mad at you when you do that, but we had a press release on it a few weeks ago, and it's rather than excluding names through a series of rules or sectors, it's actually the active manager is going to make bets on companies that the portfolio team thinks have the best sustainable practices. Their thesis is this portfolio will outperform the broad market. In some ways, because it's a broad-based U.S. mutual fund with a small minimum, it's going to be one of the great test cases for this. And even there, that's going to take a long time before you really have a sense.
Yeah. So I think of Vanguard, I think of BlackRock, two investing companies that have insane level of assets under control, large. 5 trillion at Vanguard. I forget what it is at BlackRock, but
about 6, I think.
About 6. And when you were there, and it's probably still true at Vanguard, certainly BlackRock with Larry Fink, a lot of talk, okay, so what role can we play? It's more sort of a passive investment play, but you both have been very outspoken about long-termism, about sustainable strategies, about doing the right thing. Does that you both get good press for that? Does that translate into anything tangible?
So I think so. Hard to know. Again, it's been a short period of time, but just to frame it a little bit, how this all came about. So my predecessor, Jack Brennan, actually was one of the first people in the investment management world to actually write a letter to portfolio companies. And the reason he wrote the first letter on our behalf was we were really frustrated. This is in the early to mid-2000s by some of the activist hedge funds in particular who were out there re-engineering companies for short-term gain and so forth. And these guys would come in and they'd have 1% stakes and they'd literally be changing out boards and changing corporate strategies. And we have both active funds at Vanguard, but we also have a huge index franchise, as you know. and you're a permanent shareholder when you're an index fund. So, you have to. You can't sell a company when you don't like what they're doing. So we were seeing companies begin to make decisions that we thought actually were not good for the long term. And we were thinking about our investors, and again, very selfishly, our investors on average, the average turnover of Vanguard's client base is about 8%, which means the average holding period is about 12 years. And so they're long-term oriented as well. And so we viewed our role as to stand up for those guys. And so that's when Jack wrote the first sort of letter with some broad principles. And then it really was during the crisis, it became so much more apparent to the leadership team and me that we needed to do more. So we took one of our best thinkers on the topic. Many of you in the room know him, Glenn Borum, and we said, Glenn had a big portfolio of things he was doing, including all the proxy voting for us. And we said, your whole life is going to be governance, and build a team, and let's take this more seriously. Recognizing again, and if you think about it from the company standpoint, what we heard from many CEOs and CFOs was this was really good news from their perspective, in the sense that somebody was actually going to come in and say, I don't care about the quarter. I mean, we literally don't care about the quarter. Like, it matter, if you own a stock forever, what do you care? What you care about is that company going to create long-term value for your investors? Now, you might say, well, you're so, it's just a passive approach, and how much can you really do? When you find people who you think have really crossed the line from a governance standpoint, for example, then you're going to have to take action. So, again, this is all public, but a couple of years ago there was a REIT holding in our one of our index funds. It was we own 10% of this REIT, and an activist actually came in and said, this company is violating every principle that you guys believe in. And they walked us through our own principles, and they were completely right. And we had not been as focused on this. And they said, we're thinking of launching a different slate of directors. What do you guys think? And we tried to engage with the company. They wouldn't talk to us. And what ended up happening was the company. So there was a vote, and vote was due to close at 8 p.m. East Coast time, 5 p.m. West Coast time, so it's 7:30 at my house, and I have an unlisted number, so to this day I have no idea what happened, but my phone rings, and I didn't pay attention to the call thing, and so I picked it up like a dope, and it's the chairman of this group, and he says, I can't believe you guys are voting against us. And I said, well, I can't believe you're calling me at 7:30 at night. And he's like, is there any way you will reverse the vote? And I said, no. And he goes, but what do you care? You're an index fund. And I said, you're the worst performing stock in this 235 stock index. And if you just performed average, our investors would be, not significantly, because it was 1 out of 200 stocks, but they would be better off measurably, quantifiable, right? Quantifiable, if they were just an average performing company. So, and I tell this story, it's an anecdote, it's not, but it really underscored what, in a sense, you can do, and what you will do if things get to that point. We're not going to come in and, if you look at some of the activist managers who will come in and look at a company and say, we think your consumer strategy for this sector of your business is all screwed up, and you need to change direction, and the leader there doesn't know what he's doing, and you should have we can't, we own that stock. We're not going to get into that kind of tactical level of discussion. We're going to look at how is the board governing the company, how's the board thinking about those issues, what kind of reaction does the board have, and that's where I think there is occasionally confusion out there as to what our role is versus what somebody else's role is.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little bit about sustainable investments, sustainable companies. What is that? I mean, we talk about companies. We celebrate a company like Walmart that's doing a lot of good stuff, and there are plenty of people who think Walmart is a bad company because of its labor. Pepsi, is Pepsi good? You could sort of make the case. So when you're thinking about these investments, how do you even find a definition of who's doing what?
Yeah. So So for us, and again, just full transparency, the easiest part of ESG for us is G. You know, we have a set of principles that we believe in very deeply, and we think, and again, we can't prove this, so again, full disclosure, but we believe better governed companies over time are likely to perform better. It doesn't guarantee you that you won't have a disaster on your hand. You can have a really good governed company in a sense, and they can still make mistakes and be, you know, but what you hope is you shrink the number of those disasters over time with better governance, and maybe you raise raise everybody up a little bit. You know, the E and the S are a lot harder to define because in this room we're going to have 50 different opinions as to, you know, what's really what really matters from an environmental standpoint. What really matters from a company, what really matters for a company in terms of its social impact and so forth. So, you know, what we almost reverse the question when people come to us. We say, show us the link to long-term value creation, or at least the potential link to long-term value creation, and we'll roll up our sleeves and go deep. So I don't actually have a great definition because the variables are so many. But what we want to see is we want to see somebody actually, when we're talking about these issues, and it's going to differ sector by sector and company by company, link the particular topic to the impact of either value creation or value destruction in the long run.
Yeah.
And I know that's not a terribly satisfying answer, but you know, I think one of the things that you know, between SASB, the Embankment Project, you know, a lot of the work that's going on in a number of academic institutions is trying to figure out, are there broad metrics that can be predictive of some of these, some of these factors, and allow you as an investor or allow you as a consumer perhaps to compare and contrast. And it's the comparability that actually is, again, been very elusive in a lot of these cases.
Yeah. So G, I guess, is relatively easy because you're
well,
measuring
I would,
board
again,
members.
I would say it's easier to define.
Right.
It's challenging to get it to work right.
Yeah. So we do an annual survey of the best performing CEOs, and ESG rating is a significant part of that. And we used to rely on one company to do the ratings, and then thought, well, what if they, it's so subjective that is that fair? So now we take ESG ratings from a number of companies, average them out. I don't know if that increases statistical error manyfold or if that's a fair way of doing it, but I was able to see the numbers. They certainly vary dramatically in how sort of outsiders look at companies. Bob Eccles, I don't know if he's still here, but he is a big player in the field, and he actually has written a piece for Harvard Business Review that we're running soon that is really arguing that investors are finally starting to mainstream ESG considerations in their investments. Are you seeing that? Are you sensing that?
Absolutely. So, and again, one of the benefits of being who we are is we get to talk to almost everybody. Because again, for those of you who aren't familiar, everybody thinks all we do is index, and we've been a pioneer in that space. But our heritage, actually, if you go all the way back to the very beginning, was active management. So we have 70 active funds or 75 active funds, both on the fixed income side and the equity side. And on the equity side, we don't run those in-house. We actually use sub-advisors all around the world. So PrimeCap in California, Bailey Gifford in Scotland, Schroders in London, Barrow Hanley Mooney and Strauss in Dallas, et cetera, Wellington in Boston, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's literally 30 some odd firms running those mandates for us. 2008, 9, we went to all of our active managers and basically said, so how do you guys think about ESG, and how important is it in your investment process? And we got a big fat 0. Mm-hmm. Like, no one wanted to talk about it. They're like, you guys are actually a pain in our butts for even bringing this up. Go do whatever you want to do on the governance side, but leave us alone. And it's interesting, a decade later, it's completely changed. And the vast majority, and I don't think it's just because of their affiliation with us. Certainly there's some cause and effect there, but the vast majority of the firms are actually beginning to think about this quite differently. And again, I'll pick on Wellington, our most important strategic partner as an active manager. Mark Mandel and his team there have devoted tens of millions of dollars of resources to the research capabilities to try to suss out whether some of these factors that you reference in all the different measures and so forth can be compared, contrasted, and can actually help a portfolio manager predict a company that might outperform over a very long time. And so there's a lot more interest in that than there was. I would tell you though, for it to really take hold, and again, I apologize to any active firms in the audience who are going to find this offensive, active management has to change. If you look at the statistics in the mutual fund world, and you can apply it to the pension world and separate accounts and so forth, the portfolio turnover completely belies any focus on sustainability or long-termism. The average holding period for a broad-based U.S. equity fund is about 1.2 years. And if you take the portfolio turnover and just take the inverse of it, now you could say, okay, let's refine it. Let's talk about pure name turnover. Maybe the holding period goes out to 2 years. That is not long term. And one of the things, and again, I can't prove this because the sample is not large enough. But if you were to look at Vanguard, just as a little microcosm, if you looked at our best performing funds over the last 25 years, the one thing they all have in common is very low portfolio turnover. So we either by luck or our own bias have identified certain firms and certain individuals in those firms who believe in taking a very long-term view. And to me, this is where the sustainability and this is where it's all going to come together, because if you're really worried about the quarter and you're going to flip the stock every 2 years, all this stuff isn't going to matter. But if you're looking to hold a stock for 8-10 years, companies that aren't practicing some level of good sustainability practice, in my opinion, they're not going to be, their likelihood of success is lower, because they're not going to be great places, for employees to go. They're not going to be, consumers are going to begin to express their preferences and all that. So that's where I think there's an interesting opportunity. But the active management industry in general is going to have to reflect that. And I do see evidence that that's happening. I don't think, and again, with all due respect, I don't think sustainability was the driver. I actually think the initial driver was cost. And people want to know, why does indexing beat active management over long periods of time? It's not only fee structure differences, it's the trading cost differences. So if you're turning a portfolio over 80-90%, that's about 150 basis point drag, even in today's low trading cost environment. You take that plus the fee difference, that's a lot for an active manager to overcome. And what you're beginning to see is a lot of active managers say, we got to have more, conviction in our names. If we really think we're onto something, we got to stay with it longer. And you are beginning to see portfolio turnover ratchet down a little bit. To me, it's going to be the only way that and you are seeing much more use of what I would call high conviction products at least in the consumer side of investment management.
So you sort of hinted before that some of the forces driving change are employees who want to work for a company that they believe in, consumers who want to buy products from a company who they think shares their values. That's probably pretty clear to even sort of analyze anecdotally and maybe overall in terms of data. But then the investment side seems a little different. I mean, the investment side, kind of putting together what you said, is that most of us are interested in long-term. Most of us have our money invested in the long term. A minority of people who are holding, 2 years is a long time compared to a lot of where these holdings are. But whatever, 1% activists and are kind of driving more corporate change than the silent majority that has money and has long-term interests. How can we do anything with that? and I ask that particularly as we kind of roll up to an election cycle where, at the very least, there are a lot of ideas out there. So it's a time to kind of think about fixing some of these. Improving some of these.
Again, I tend to be pretty optimistic that the marketplace is beginning to move in that direction, because if you just look at the firms that are successful, so, and some of your colleagues at Harvard have written about the other side of this, which is a whole other topic.
What?
But yeah, why? It does not pay to be really successful in any industry right now, because once you're successful, somebody's coming at you. So, but if you think about today in the U.S., so and again globally it's a little bit less, but and I'm going to use broad market. We own at Vanguard 6 to 8% of every company. BlackRock is a little smaller than we are domestically, so they may own 5 of every company, depending on their active, some of their active bets. State Street's another 4 or 5. So you've got 3 investors who own 20% who are permanent shareholders. There's no interest among any, we don't talk to each other about this, but it would be illogical for anybody to be thinking short term. You look at the big active managers who are having some success as franchises. As I said, their portfolio turnover historically very high. You're beginning to see people rethink that. And if you get to a point where you've got 30, 40% of a company held by 15 firms who have longer term aspirations than the activists who are coming in with their smaller positions, that will change the dialogue. And again, a lot gets made of each of these activist situations, but usually there's about 30 contentious proxy votes a year in the entire broad market. So we, in a sense, we shouldn't overreact to that either. But I think you're going to see the longer term orientation begin to take hold. Now, could government do anything to help it? Sure. You could change the tax code to make it even more, make it more advantageous for investors. And imagine if you, I didn't get very far with this when after the election in 2008, we got asked, if you could change one thing in the tax code, what would you do? And I went right at capital gains and said, look, for somebody who holds something for 10 years, I'd reduce the rate to very single digits. 1 to 5 years, I'd be at whatever ordinary income is. Less than that, I'd be higher than ordinary income. I was not particularly popular with the algorithmic traders, the hedge fund traders, Wall Street in general. Even a few of my colleagues were like, are you sure? What's that going to do to liquidity and all this stuff? But at the end of the day, if you wanted to send a message that long-termism is important, that would, tax code would be an obvious way to do it. And you could do that without, which in a way that would be completely revenue neutral, and just tilt the discussion. Today, long-term is defined as 1 year. That's what it is. Yep. And you get, as long as you hold a security for more than a year, you get a huge advantage from a tax rate standpoint. That, from a policy standpoint, that doesn't totally make sense to me.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll open up to the floor. So be ready. Probably should have asked this before. What is long-termism? So I talk to CEOs all the time and talk about their perspective and their, compensation. Yeah. They're like, no, I'm long-term and my compensation is long-term, and yes, it's a big problem, but not with me and everything's fine. So there's that issue. It's a big problem, but no small problems. But more than that, how do you? So you're creating funds, or Vanguard's creating funds that are about, whether companies are successfully thinking long term. What is? How do you know when that's happening?
Yeah, look. This is why they pay you the big money. You ask all these hard questions.
And I don't have to have answers to any of them.
I know. This is great.
Yes, it is great.
Turn it right around,
Just try.
Yeah, I know. I'm not going there. Now, look, the definition of, in all seriousness, it's a very hard, all this is hard to define. That's part of the problem. So I'm going to come at it, this is completely unscientific. I'm going to come at it just from a practical standpoint. one of the interesting things is I've had the opportunity of being in the investment world for 33 years, so I've gotten to see a lot and watch a lot, but I also had to run a company. And one of the things that you figure out pretty quickly is no one is great at predicting the future. Like, the human brain just isn't wired to really go beyond a couple of years and really understand what's going on. I think the practical sort of way to think about it, I think somewhere in that 5 to 10 year range is about as far out as you can define long term. And most CEOs don't think that far out. And you can make a case, and it's going to differ by industry, by the way, too, because cycles are faster in some industries by a lot. You could make a case that there are places where, some of the pharma CEOs will tell you they got to be thinking in 25-year cycles. That's really hard to do, and it's really hard to be accountable for it. But I do think you can be reasonably accountable for that 5 to 10 year kind of time range. And to me, when I'm, and again, doing this more as an amateur analyst than a professional, when I'm analyzing CEOs and companies and people I admire and so forth, that's kind of how I do it. What did they accomplish over 5 or 10 years? Not what did they do for 12 months or 24 months. Much longer than that, it's hard to see out that much farther. But look, the farther we could push that out, I think the better we'd be. But you have to have, and there's one other thing there that your question brings to mind, which you didn't ask, but I'm going to say it anyway. This doesn't have to be an argument about short versus long. I would change it to a conversation. I would always start with long, but I would say it should be a conversation about long and short. You have to earn the right. So you can't take your eye off short-term performance, but you shouldn't be obsessed about it. And public companies shouldn't cater to the sell side's every whim about a penny here or a penny there, and in a sense think maniacally about that. That never has made any sense to me. But if you have a long-term strategy, you got to have milestones that are shorter term, and you've got to adjust. And one of the first things you learn, anybody who's operated at that level, whatever strategy you set out for 5 to 10 years, you will be wrong. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how quickly do you recognize that, and how quickly do you pivot? Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other set of discussions. But I actually think it doesn't make it incorrect to still be focused on that kind of time frame as adequate.
So you've observed before that a lot of these considerations are driving companies to either go private or stay private. Is that a good thing or a bad thing if there are fewer public companies?
Yeah, so again, we were having a good debate about this beforehand. The number of public companies peaked in the late 90s at about 9,000. That was probably too many. There were a lot of little splinter companies taken public just because the manic market, especially in the tech sector. We're down to 3,700 public companies today. There are 140 U.S. unicorns. There are another couple hundred global unicorns. If you're me, and I say me, Vanguard, and you're trying to offer the average investor, the small investor, the opportunity for growth, there's 140 companies that 10 years ago would be public today, and they may be the engines of a lot of our economic growth right now, and our investors can't share in that. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing from a social policy standpoint, and I also don't think it's a good thing from a capital markets standpoint, and I can't prove this, but and again, you don't want to confuse causation and correlation here, but one of the things that when you travel the world that everyone admires about the U.S. is the balance that we've had among public and private capital markets and the banking system. And if you look at it historically, we have the most diversification there in terms of sources of capital. You go to Europe, 90% of capital flows through the banking system. You go to China, it's 90% flows through the government / the banking system. And they all look at us and say, gee, I wonder if the U.S.'s incredible economic growth during this period is partly a reflection of having this much more effective way of allocating capital. And I can't prove it, but I sense that there's something there. And I know some of your colleagues are doing work on this, or some of the people at Harvard are doing work on this. And I don't think it's, look, I love private markets. I think they're a really important part of our economy. But one of the things we worry a lot about is that companies are increasingly deciding to stay private because it's just a lot easier to do so. And there's so much money out there. The cost of capital is so close to what the cost of public capital is. It's worth it.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's something that a lot of people have missed. And I think it's something from a public policy standpoint is going to be really front and center for, and it's interesting, a lot of the things that people want to do actually I think will exacerbate the problem. So, when I listen to a lot of the wealth and income disparity discussions, which are real, and the data are overwhelming on that, many of the solutions, though, are going to force even more companies to stay private, and that's just going to actually exacerbate the situation. So one of the, I think one of the things, and obviously for Vanguard, it benefits our business model, so I'm always going to be transparent about that, but if I remove myself from Vanguard for a minute, this public market thing is a really big deal. And it's been interesting. The SEC has actually been pretty forward-looking in terms of talking about it, and you can tell that they're quite concerned about it.
Let's open to questions from all of you. Yeah.
What current investment strategies have kind of always had this long-termism built into, like, for sustainability? I'm thinking of like things like dividend growers type of strategies. Vanguard's got a dividend growers fund. Are there already strategies that you've seen that already had a lot of these concepts already embedded?
So, yeah, great question. I think they have elements of it, but even in a dividend grower strategy, historically there have been a lot of sin stocks that could, that have been able to, that have increased dividends who could be eligible for that. So you end up with a little bit of a mix there. The most data we have are, on our socially responsible index fund, which has been around since the 90s, so it's 20 plus years. And as I said at the beginning, it's very time period dependent on whether it underperforms or outperforms its broader, the broad benchmark upon which it's sort of based. And it's really been kind of, it's really a wash right now. So we don't have, what I would say really good data on strategies that have been built around sustainability. We have elements of them, and like the dividend growers. I mentioned earlier that some of our portfolios that have very low turnover have outperformed. If you look at Vanguard Prime Cap Fund, which has been around since 1985, at one point it was 300 basis points ahead of the broad market on an annual basis. Now, of course, we always are like, how can that be? We're an index guy, right? But their portfolio turnover has averaged about 10%. But they haven't restricted themselves in terms of sectors and so forth, and I know from their investment process, sustainability was never at the top of their list in terms of when they were looking at, which companies to own for 10 years. And so you end up with sort of a mixed, unfortunately, it's sort of like a mixed data set, and it's really hard to disaggregate what's actually going on there. I don't know if that helps, but.
Back here and then up here. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I had two questions that combine. The first is, can you give us
Whoa, wait. Pick one.
Okay.
Pick the best one.
A short list of results that came about as your August 2017 letter on governance to all the companies you own?
So, we sent a letter, that was a letter where we laid out the governance principles. I think the most important thing that happened there was in the subsequent 18 months, let's say, we had more than 1,000 engagements with companies, and I would say 30% of those engagements were with independent directors. And in many cases, they sought us out rather than us seeking them out. And we took that as a really good sign that maybe we had reached an inflection point in terms of boards actually responding to the voice of a long-term investor. If you were to go talk to an IR department 7 or 8 years ago and say, do you ever talk to the index funds that own you, they would have laughed. They would have said, why? We don't even bother. And they never met Vanguard, never met BlackRock, never met State Street, and so forth. After that letter, that level of engagement to us was incredibly, it was energizing, but it was also, it signaled to us that there was something here. And what a lot of the discussions were, they were sort of twofold. One, they wanted us to talk through some of the details of the principles and where they may fall short, and what suggestions we might have, what best practices we might see. In some cases, it was, we just want to know you, we want to understand, the depth of your beliefs here, because if we get into an issue, we'd rather know you before we get into an issue. And it was, again, for us, it was actually, I won't say vindication, but it really reinforced that we were onto something here. That was probably the number one thing.
Yeah, hi, Rick Bailsmith from
Rick.
Center for Sustainable Business on the board, and also Stern. Do you think you're underestimating the effects of climate change and all the investments? To me, if you follow the IPCC report and 1.5 degree climate change, the Earth warming, that would create a massive paradigm shift in business globally. And do you ever take that into effect? Because investors, and they're saying this is not taken into account fully.
Yeah.
In the investment world.
Yeah, and it's a really hard one, Rick, because what do you do?
Yeah.
I'm very serious. So, we own, let's just use the S&P 500 just as a proxy for the U.S. stock market. Obviously we have a total stock market. We own the S&P 500 in an index fund. We are required to own all 500 stocks. It's a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. That's why they're there. We can talk about climate change. We can talk about disclosure. We can talk about how their board is thinking about it. But at the end of the day, we can't say, well, we're going to eliminate these 20 companies because we think they're not living up to their end of the bargain in terms of moving the dial here. So it's a very difficult question for us, and I think for all investors, how you approach that. This is, again, it's such a systemic issue. This is a place, and I know you were going to ask me the question earlier. Is there any place where you want government? This is the more systemic the issue. This is where I think governments do need to stand up and do things differently, which allow, in a sense, the markets to follow. I will say, though, again, probably the most controversial vote we were involved in, the one I got the most hate mail on, and again, just for this audience, you guys will appreciate this. We voted against management's recommendations, against the board's recommendations on Exxon a year ago on their disclosure. And we did it, not because of the data that you just described, which is compelling, and again, I think we understand that. We did it because they refused to, in a sense, comment on the impact of climate change on their business, on their financial future and so forth, where their competitors actually were beginning to lay out pretty good information where, especially as an investment person, you could look at it and say, I can make some judgments in terms of how to think about the future value of this company more effectively. And for us, that was a way to sort of come at this, but that doesn't really get at the heart of the issue that you described.
Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, Shelley Goldberg. Thank you both for a great discussion. I was curious about your feelings toward having, say, different share classes for a stock, such that long-term holders would benefit with either more dividends or greater voting.
Again, it's a really interesting question, and the short answer is I don't know. I'm intrigued by the concept. Historically, we've been against different share classes with different rights because frankly, it's been abused most times. Many of your tech companies who did go public in the late 90s. There's a number of them who have dual share class, and basically it allows the founders with very small economic interest to control the vote, as you know. We've never thought that was a particularly good idea. And so at the high level, we've usually, and again, there are circumstances where we're willing to say, okay, for a period of time, we get what you're trying to do, but what's the path forward? What you described, though, would be a completely different use of new share classes. I think it's one of those things that needs to be studied. It's intriguing because without, and again, it goes back to your question earlier, are there things that could be done to signal the importance of long-term? I think that the trick will be not to let it get so narrow that like you're creating like all these niche share classes and it's not the flavor of the day. It would have to be something big, and it could be, holding period with additional voting rights, or it could be, that's probably the one that would be the most appealing to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a couple of your answers caveat with, I don't know, we don't have the right information to make that correlation. So how do you feel about your role as an investor in increasing adoption of some of the frameworks you mentioned, like SASB and TCFD, so that you would have the comparable quality data that's lacking holes that would enable you to decide whether or not there's an alpha correlation, or one of the other things that you said there was a lack of data to identify?
Yeah, I think again, Lee, it's a very, very fair question, and as you know, we're pretty involved with SASB. We're pretty involved with the embankment project, and all of that work is around trying to help these frameworks become more robust and richer, so that there is comparability from company to company within sectors, and broad comparability sector to sector. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're on a good path. And so what we're trying to do is be very value add in those conversations with things that we've seen that work versus things that don't work. And my colleague, two of my colleagues are heavily involved in each of those, and we're going to continue. It's been a big investment. The embankment one in particular, we took a team to actually do a lot of the work in conjunction with Ernst & Young and the Inclusive Capitalism team Linda Rothschild runs, again, trying to push forward so that we do get to those kind of frameworks where I don't have to say we don't know.
But I guess the question I have is there any sort of downward pressure that you could start putting on your holdings to start adoption? I don't think there's a lack of, I think the frameworks are pretty good. There's just not adoption. And that seems to be the biggest hurdle that I see right now.
Yeah, I think I think that's probably coming, but I think that's one of those things where I would have a slightly different view as to the maturity of some of those frameworks. But I don't think we're talking years. I think we're talking relatively short periods of time to sort of get to the point where you could begin to drive that. And I'm going to give you one that you didn't mention, but we've had active discussions at CECP with the Business Roundtable in terms of getting companies to voluntarily adopt, all the members there, the requirement to do a long-term, to lay out a long-term plan. That to me would be a really valuable step here. And as you know, we help work to create that framework. So I think we're going to see, some progress on that front. And then, in terms of how much pressure to bring to bear going forward, I think that remains to be seen.
So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's one back there. Yep.
EES has made you largest shareholder in some controversial companies, inadvertently done, albeit. How do you think about fiduciary responsibility and long-term, individual long-term approach with
You think I ask hard questions?
Yeah, no, look. So, look, if you own if you invest in an index that has controversial holdings, as a fiduciary, actually, our responsibility is to match the index, and we can offer investors a choice without that, which are ESG ETFs do. But if you're in a broad-based fund, you actually, and the stock is in the benchmark, then you've got to reflect that stock in the benchmark. That's just that is a fiduciary responsibility that trumps everything. From a legal perspective, from actually, I would say more than a legal perspective, an ethical perspective for your investors who've chosen that fund because it's going to it's going to match that market. It is, those topics are the ones that probably cause the most angst among our own people and certainly our shareholders. I would say too, though, one of the things, I had this debate with a university student a couple of years ago now, my alma mater, around the endowment. And he was leading this campaign to get the endowment to basically drop all energy, all integrated oils, and basically all energy companies of that ilk from their portfolio. And they were actually ultimately successful. And he asked me what I thought about the strategy. And I said, well, what are you trying to accomplish? And he said, we're trying to hurt the company. And I said, you realize this has zero impact on the company. And he looked at me like I was from Mars. I'm a little embarrassed that somebody at my alma mater's basic economic understanding was this minimal, but he was an engineer, so I'll give him credit for that. But we had this back and forth. I said, show me the impact on the balance sheet, show me the impact on the income statement. And I said, all you've done is trade one owner for another. And you've accomplished nothing. And he said, well, what would you do differently? I said, if I were you, I would be going around to all the other universities, and I would be finding like-minded people, and I would go get all those endowment officers and say, we as students of this collective group feel very strongly about the role these companies are playing in society, and we want to have a stronger voice. So can we pool our interests together so that our ownership voice actually has a little bit more carry? I said, you have a much better chance of influencing by being engaged as an owner than forcing somebody to sell the stock. And in all of these situations, that's actually the case. And again, this goes back to Adi's point earlier on the private. What's going to happen in many of these situations is these companies are just going to go private. It's just, and I actually don't think that's necessarily a good thing either, because then you lose all transparency and you actually lose the ability to, at least from a governance standpoint, to try to impact how they think about some of these issues long term. I know it's not necessarily a totally or a satisfying answer, but I actually think that's at the heart of the reality of what a lot of us have to deal with.
All right, we've got time for one final question, no pressure. Well, if there isn't a question, let me ask you. So you said at one point you started to say I'm an optimist. So why don't you leave us with the F. William McNabb III case for optimism on all these things we've talked about?
All right, I'm going to pour the glass. So the glass is almost full. Look, I think the fact that this discussion is taking place is a really good thing. Tansi and her team, I just give you guys huge kudos for pulling this together. We're seeing, Andrew, you and I met, what was it, 18 months ago at Bloomberg session. Again, the fact that these sessions are happening and they're happening more broadly, I think is a really good sign. You've probably picked up where I think, investors can be the most impactful is driving governance and long-termism and the relationship there. And in a sense, sustainability will become part of that. Broader sustainability becomes part of that long-term view. These conversations did not exist a decade ago. They just, except there was a handful of purists who were trying to create new funds, socially responsible in the 90s and so forth, but these broad-based conversations were not happening. I think the fact that they're happening and they're happening in a productive way is a real positive sign. I think we are close to a potential inflection point on this short-term versus long-term. I really think that's at the heart of this. I think if we can, and we'll never, we all won't agree on all the various components, right? But if we can get companies thinking longer term versus short term, 90% of what we're talking about from an ESG standpoint will get very heavy consideration, because that's what companies are going to need to do to create long-term value. If we don't get, if we're not successful there, then I wouldn't be pessimistic, but I really think we're going to be successful there, because I think the marketplace has, if you look at where the ownership of these companies now resides, if you look at the voices that are beginning to be heard much more effectively, it's actually pretty rapid progress in a sector of the economy or a sector of our industry that doesn't change very fast.
Mm-hmm.
So I continue to think we're going to make a lot of progress here.
All right. Tansi, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Addie, for an amazing job moderating, and Bill for expanding our minds and really helping us think through these challenging issues, right? So a few final thoughts from the day before we go get to drink, which I know you're waiting for. You can move from the water, Bill, to the to the wine. So thinking about what we heard today from our investor panel earlier, we heard that investors are really beginning to use ESG data embedded in their analysis of how they think about a company, right? It's adding more information, imperfect information, but more information to how they make decisions. We also heard that not all investors are the same. Everybody has a different way of approaching this. And we also heard from Bill, for example, short-term investors have a very different perspective from long-term investors. So thinking about that question of the long-term, and also how in many cases, companies might be talking about sustainability, or investors may be talking about sustainability issues or ESG issues, but not using those words, right? And so when they're talking about something that is of long-term importance, it might actually be an ESG issue, but it isn't articulated that way. So also for something for us to think about. We also heard, consumers, that we're seeing a really interesting shift here, that we've heard in the past, well, consumers aren't really asking for it except for a small percentage. And really today, where we're seeing the growth, 50% in the consumer packaged good business is from sustainability marketed products, which again, going to the long-term point that you were raising, Bill, is those companies that are thinking ahead, right, and changing their business now to deal with trends that are happening now as opposed to constantly reacting is also a really important thing to be thinking about. We also heard a bit about sort of regulators, and sort of regulators are beginning to take more, not necessarily in this country, but even in this country in certain areas, taking more of a proactive focus, and probably will be doing so more as we see more challenges related to climate change and also to some of the social issues in this country that we're dealing with. So we introduced you, those of you who hadn't met her yet, to Rosie. We had a great conversation with you, really about how Rosie can be both a forward-looking tool, so as you're thinking about strategy and what investments you might make, how to really analyze your return on sustainability investment, and also retrospectively. And most importantly, just as investors need this data to be making their decisions, corporates need to better understand where the value is being created in order for them to make better decisions about strategy, about investment, and about priorities. We heard some wonderful examples. So, I think all of you will leave with the beautiful work that Patagonia is doing around childcare and women, and sort of to bring, to think about their employees as a family. And we know that this is an issue across this country in terms of women not being able to go to work because they don't have anyone to take care of their children, in terms of a variety of other issues that Patagonia is addressing. And we also heard that Patagonia said, and by the way, though this isn't why we did it, it's really good business for us, and here's the financial returns, right? And we also heard, on the environmental side, how the automotive sector is seeing really significant returns and better work around recalls, around innovation, around operational efficiencies, and a variety of other great examples. I heard from the team in the workshops that you all had some really good feedback. There's some very specific stuff that I won't go through here. But basically, one that you felt one of the challenges will be how to socialize ROSI, right, within your companies. How do we socialize this methodology more broadly? And so that's something we'll be thinking about. We'll be looking forward to talking with you further about. The other is that the sort of big aha for many of you is that actually large returns are actually possible on when you're investing in sustainability. That when you put together all these different pieces that are in all the different parts of the company, you actually come up with really big numbers. And the other part of that insight that I heard from one of the workshops was, hey, if all this value is being created in all these different parts of the company, that's accruing to those different units' bottom line. So actually, we can probably build engagement across the company around better assessing the return on sustainability investment, because it's in their interest to do so, because they're actually leaving money on the table because they're not analyzing this correctly. So you can build a broader coalition for what you're doing here. Let me say that, again, I think this is brought up by a couple people, not everything needs to be monetized, right? There doesn't need to be a financial business case for everything. It's just that without the financial case, we're being held back and we're not making the right decisions. So let's get on it and get ROSI into every house and home. We need to together bust the myths, like the consumer myth that consumers don't care, or the myth that you really can't make much money off of this stuff, or it costs you money is actually really the myth. The myth is that this costs you more than you make back from it. And I'll just echo what we heard from Bill, which is we all need to think long-term while still acting in the short term, right? So I want to thank you all for a great day, for a great engagement. I want to thank the team at Center for Sustainable Business, again, for all the terrific work they did to prepare for today. And I want to thank our panelists and moderators, our sponsors, Domtar, Bloomberg, and HBR, for them. Let's give them all a great big round of applause.